The winter fog clung to the English airfields like a heavy curtain when the first P-47 Thunderbolts arrived in early 1943. The ground crews heard the engines before they saw the aircraft. A slow thunder, deep and uneven at first, rolling across the field as if some giant machine was waking from a long sleep. Men stepped out of hangars, pulling jackets tight against the cold, expecting to see another shipment of P-38s or a flight of Spitfires from a nearby base. But when the shapes finally emerged through the fog, they stopped and stared. The Thunderbolt was enormous. It looked less like a fighter and more like a flying piece of industrial machinery. Broad wings, thick fuselage, a nose ringed by the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine. It did not glide gracefully like a Spitfire or slice the air like a P-51. It pushed the air aside with brute force, like a heavyweight boxer throwing himself forward with every step. Some pilots laughed when they saw it for the first time. "You want me to fight in that? It looks like a milk jug with wings." It was the beginning of the nickname that stuck, the Flying Milk Jug, the Jug. Even some American pilots whispered doubts. They had trained on lighter aircraft, machines that darted and spun and climbed like birds. This thing seemed too big, too heavy, too slow. It felt like the kind of machine that would drop out of the sky if you looked at it the wrong way. No one in England trusted it yet. Across the Channel, in occupied Europe, the Luftwaffe heard the same rumors. German intelligence officers studied blurry reconnaissance photographs and scoffed openly. They measured the wingspan, the weight, the service ceiling. They read early reports that said the Jug was not particularly agile and that its climb rate was disappointing compared to the Bf-109G or the FW-190A. German aces laughed. Too heavy, too slow, too clumsy. They told younger pilots that if they ever saw one, they should ignore it until the real threats arrived. The Spitfires and early Mustangs were dangerous. The Jug was simply big. Bigger meant easier to hit. In the officers' mess, a veteran pilot with more than 30 kills declared, "If that thing ever tries to climb with us, it will fall out of the sky." It was spoken with such confidence that no one questioned it. Back in England, as the fog lifted across the spring fields, the American pilots began learning the truth about their new fighter. It was not built for elegance. It was not built for tight turns or long spiraling climbs. It was built for endurance. It was built for survival. And above all, it was built for power. The first time pilot Jack Malone pushed the throttle forward, he felt the entire aircraft rumble beneath him. The R2800 engine roared like a wild animal, pulling the Jug down the runway with a force that shook the stick in his hand. The aircraft lifted off the ground almost reluctantly, as if it had decided to fly only because its engine demanded it. But once it was airborne, something strange happened. The Jug did not waver, it did not struggle, it surged forward with a steadiness that surprised Malone so much he forgot to speak into the radio for several seconds. At higher altitude, the aircraft felt different again. The weight, the bulk, the huge radial engine, all of it seemed to settle into balance. The P-47 was not meant to climb like a racer. It was meant to reach altitude with patience. And once it got there, it owned the sky around it. When Malone leveled off at 30,000 feet, he felt something new. Control, stability, quiet power humming deep within the wings. He rolled into a shallow dive and felt the Jug accelerate with a hunger he had never experienced in any other fighter. It picked up speed smoothly, steadily, without hesitation. The veteran pilots watching from the ground saw it too. "Maybe she is not so bad," one of them muttered. "Still slow," said another. "Still ugly. Still a milk jug." But when the P-47 taxied back to the line, its engine growling as it cooled, Malone climbed down from the cockpit with a look they had not expected. "This thing is a monster." "A good monster or a bad one?" they asked. Malone thought for a moment. "That depends on who is flying it, or who is trying to catch it." For weeks, the pilots trained, pushing the Jug to understand its limits. They learned quickly that it was nearly impossible to break the aircraft with normal flight stresses. Its massive radial engine could take punishment for hours. Its thick skin could absorb bullets that would rip a P-38 apart. And when a pilot nosed it down into a dive, it accelerated like nothing they had ever flown. One instructor said quietly after landing from a test dive, "This thing does not fall, it drops like thunder." But the true test was coming. In April 1943, the P-47 was finally cleared for combat escort duty. The bombers of the 8th Air Force would be flying deeper into enemy territory, and they needed protection at high altitude. The Jug was ready. As the first combat group lined up on the runway, the pilots exchanged glances. No one laughed at the nickname now. The Jug might look strange, but it moved with confidence and force. The pilots knew they were flying something powerful, something new, something the enemy still underestimated. Engines roared, dust swirled, the ground shuddered beneath the weight of the aircraft. One pilot whispered into his mask before takeoff, "If they think this thing is slow, they haven't seen it dive." The P-47s lifted into the sky, climbing slowly at first, then leveling off and advancing toward the coast. As they crossed the channel, the sunlight glinted off their broad wings, turning them into silver shapes against the pale blue horizon. Across Europe, German pilots prepared for another day of hunting. They believed the sky belonged to them. They believed they would sweep aside any American fighter that dared challenge their supremacy. They had no idea the Jug was coming, and they had no idea how quickly their laughter would turn into fear. The first time the Luftwaffe met the P-47 Thunderbolt in real combat, they thought it would be easy. It was June 1943, the warm and cloud-streaked afternoon over northern France. A formation of B-17s pushed inland, engines pounding through the thin air, their gunners scanning the sky. Far above them, 3 squadrons of Jugs held position, climbing slowly, conserving fuel, maintaining a broad escort ring. The German radar stations saw the bombers first, then came the echo of unusual signals behind them. Something large, something fast, something the operators did not recognize. They assumed it was the same American escorts that had been coming for months. P-38s, P-47s, maybe a few early Mustangs. Nothing that could threaten the supremacy of the Bf-109G and FW-190A. At a Luftwaffe field outside Lille, a group of German fighters scrambled. Engines roared, tires bounced on the dirt runway, and 20 aircraft climbed sharply into the sky. The pilots had heard about the flying milk jug, but no one took it seriously. They believed the Americans had built a heavy fighter, not a proper dogfighter, something too large to maneuver and too slow to chase. The leading German ace, a man with over 40 victories, smirked through his oxygen mask as he climbed. He spoke calmly to his wingman. "If it is that new American machine, aim for the belly. It is big. It cannot turn. It cannot climb with us." They rose to 25,000 feet, where the air thinned and the clouds stretched into a white ocean below. The bombers approached slowly, the midday sun glinting off their wings. The German formation prepared to make its usual high-angle attack. Then the ace saw something that made him hesitate. Contrails. But not bomber contrails. Fighter contrails. Thick, long, perfectly aligned. And they were above him. It made no sense. Nothing the Americans had could climb that high, that fast. Not the P-38, not the early Mustangs, not the Spitfires operating from England. Yet the contrails were there, cutting across the sky like long white scars. The first P-47 Thunderbolt rolled into view. The German ace narrowed his eyes. It was enormous, a brute, a machine that defied every rule of fighter design he had been taught, but it flew with a confidence he did not expect, and it held altitude with ease. He ordered his men to continue the assault. If the Americans wanted to fight from above, they would meet them head-on. The Jug saw the Germans climbing toward them. There was no panic, no radio chatter, no rushing. The leader of the American formation simply tilted his aircraft, sunlight catching the broad wings, and issued a single command: "Brake and dive, hit them hard." The Jugs peeled off in unison, diving like falling meteors. To the German pilots, the sight was terrifying. They had never seen such large fighters dive with such speed. The P-47 was not dropping, it was accelerating, gaining speed, gaining force, becoming something unstoppable. The air around it shivered as the radial engine roared in full fury. At 800 kilometers per hour, the Jug hit its stride. The German ace pulled up into a vertical climb, trying to counter with altitude. But the Thunderbolt pilot matched his climb angle perfectly, then pushed the nose down, letting gravity and engine power combine into one devastating attack. 850 caliber guns opened fire. The sky lit up with streaks of red flame. The rounds tore through the thin metal skin of the 109, ripping the wing apart in a single burst. The German ace never completed his turn. His aircraft disintegrated in midair, a long trail of black smoke marking the place where he had once ruled the sky. His wingman panicked, rolling hard left, but the Jug followed him easily, closing the distance with shocking speed. The German shouted something into the radio, but his words vanished in static. The Thunderbolt caught him in a high-angle convergence burst. The 109 snapped sideways, trailing fire, then plunged toward the clouds. Within 60 seconds, the Luftwaffe's attack was shattered. One German pilot who survived the engagement later said, "It was like chasing a falling train. It was too fast, too heavy, too much fire." But the shock was not over. As the battle continued, German pilots tried everything they knew. They attempted to draw the Thunderbolts into low-speed turn fights. They attempted to lure them into climbing contests. They attempted head-on passes, but the Jug pilots refused to play by those rules. They fought vertically. They fought with energy. They climbed slowly, then dove with fury, using speed as a weapon no German aircraft could match. And while the Bf-109 and FW-190 held advantages in agility, they could not catch a Jug in a dive, nor break it with a short burst of cannon fire. One 90 pilot struck a P-47 with 30 rounds of 20mm cannon fire. The Jug did not fall. It did not even smoke. It simply rolled over and kept flying, as if shrugging off the damage. The German pilot landed, walked away from his aircraft, and muttered to his mechanic, "That thing cannot be killed." Reports began to spread across Luftwaffe units, stories of Thunderbolts returning home with holes the size of fists through their wings, stories of Jug pilots ramming through flak clouds and surviving, stories of a fighter that did not break, did not stall easily, did not fall apart no matter how fast it dove. It was not graceful, it was not elegant, but it was unstoppable. And the Luftwaffe began to understand they were facing not a clumsy beast, but a new kind of predator. Back in England, American pilots felt the shift too. Their confidence grew. The doubts they once whispered about the milk jug disappeared. They began to trust the machine beneath them. They began to understand its strengths. They learned the rhythm of energy fighting, the patience of climbing, and the savage joy of unleashing 850 caliber guns in a single pass. In the ready rooms, pilots traded stories. This plane is ugly, but it hits like thunder. The first shock had only begun to ripple. And the German pilots, once laughing at the flying milk jug, were starting to realize they had made a terrible mistake. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe had already tasted the first shock of the Thunderbolt. They knew it was tough. They knew it was fast in a dive. But they did not yet understand the full extent of what the jug could do. That revelation came slowly at first, one shattered wing at a time, one broken formation after another, until the truth became undeniable. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not just another fighter. It was a force of physics turned into metal. And when it dove, the sky itself seemed to split open. It began on a cold October morning over the French coast. The clouds lay low like sheets of gray iron, and the sun flickered between them in thin, broken beams. A formation of FW-190s climbed to intercept a wave of B-17s approaching from the west. The German pilots were confident. Their 190s were excellent diving machines, fast, agile, and deadly. They had used the same tactic for years: hit the bombers hard, scatter their formation, then climb back into safety. But on that morning, the 90s saw something descending toward them from above. At first, it looked like a glint of sunlight, then another, then dozens, a long line of reflections, growing brighter, growing larger, moving faster than anything the German pilots had ever witnessed. The leader of the 90 group squinted through his canopy. "Are those ours?" His wingmen did not answer. The shapes cut through the cloud layer like stones hurled from heaven. The P-47s were diving. Not gliding, not descending, diving. The air screamed around them as the massive radial engines howled in a tone so deep that bomber crews later said it sounded like distant thunder rolling across the sky. The German pilots pulled their sticks back instinctively, trying to evade the incoming threat, but nothing moved as quickly as a jug in a dive. The Mustangs dove with precision. Spitfires dove with grace, but the P-47 dove with violence. One of the 90 pilots later wrote, "It did not fall toward us. It attacked the air itself." At almost 800 kilometers per hour, the Thunderbolt closed the distance in seconds. The lead jug lined up its 8.50 caliber guns and fired a full 2-second burst. The air lit up with long red tracers. The rounds tore into the wing of the nearest FW-190, slicing through armor and spar like a blade through cloth. The German fighter broke apart instantly, flames trailing from his fuselage as it spiraled downward. Another German pilot attempted a steep roll to escape, but the jug matched him, diving even faster, its wings trembling but unbroken. The German leveled out, pulling the throttle all the way forward, hoping raw speed would save him. It did not. The Thunderbolt caught him with ease. A short, controlled burst from all 8 guns struck the tail and spine of the 90. The aircraft shuddered, coughed smoke, and then dropped nose first, vanishing into the cloud layer below. In less than 30 seconds, the fight was decided. The German survivors fled into the broken sky, scattering in all directions. But the jugs did not chase them recklessly. They broke formation, regrouped, and climbed steadily back to altitude, their speed bleeding off slowly like a giant animal slowing its breathing after a sprint. Not a single Thunderbolt had been hit. Not a single American pilot had been forced to land. Word of the slaughter spread quickly. German pilots began warning each other. If the jug is above you, do not stay. Dive first. Do not let him dive on you. But even that advice proved useless. because the one rule the Luftwaffe lived by no longer applied. You cannot outrun a P-47 in a dive. In another engagement over Belgium, a group of Bf-190s attempted to follow Thunderbolts into a dive, hoping to catch them at lower altitude. It was the kind of aggressive move the Luftwaffe had used countless times before. But when the Germans pushed their throttles forward, airframe rattling, engines screaming, they watched in disbelief as the jugs simply pulled away from them. One German pilot later wrote after barely surviving the maneuver, "Chasing a jug downward is suicide. It is like chasing a falling star." The truth was simple. The Thunderbolt was built for speed under gravity. Its massive frame, so often mocked, now became the source of its deadliest power. The bulk, the weight, the thick wings, all of it conspired to create a fighter that could turn a descent into a weapon. But the dive was not only for combat in the air, it was for destruction on the ground. The Americans soon realized they had created not only a high-altitude fighter, but the most devastating ground attack aircraft in the European theater. The P-47 could carry bombs, rockets, and thousands of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, and it could deliver them with terrifying accuracy from a high-speed dive that few pilots on Earth could withstand. German soldiers on the ground heard the sound long before they saw the aircraft. A deep, distant roar, building steadily, echoing across valleys and forests. They would look up and see a dark speck in the sky, growing larger, growing faster, until the P-47 burst into view like a meteor trailing sunlight off its wings. There was no warning after that. Thunder, gunfire, flames. A German supply convoy traveling along a narrow road near Rouen was the first to experience the full fury of jug ground attack strikes. Trucks burst into fireballs, tanks erupted in thick black smoke, horses panicked and tore free from their harnesses. The soldiers scattered, diving into ditches, covering their heads as the jugs made pass after pass. They came in screaming dives, released bombs at low altitude, then pulled out of the attack with such force that the German soldiers swore the air itself shook. One German officer wrote, "It is not a milk jug, it is thunder made of metal." Even the Luftwaffe High Command took notice. Reports flooded their desks. FW-190 units could not break P-47 diving attacks. Flak units could not track them. Ground columns could not scatter fast enough. The Thunderbolt was rewriting the rule book of air combat, and by late 1943, the Luftwaffe had stopped laughing, because the sky itself had begun to sound like thunder, and the jug was just getting started. By early 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had already earned a reputation in the air. German pilots no longer laughed when they saw its wide wings and heavy frame. They no longer mocked its size or called it the flying milk jug. Their laughter had died somewhere over France, broken apart by the roar of a jug diving past them at impossible speed. But a new fear was about to take hold. Because the P-47 was not only a fighter, it was becoming the most devastating ground attack aircraft the war had ever seen. The transformation began slowly. At first, Thunderbolts were used almost entirely as escorts, climbing high above the bombers, engaging German fighters, and diving to scatter enemy formations. But as the Luftwaffe weakened and the Americans grew bolder, the mission shifted. The Thunderbolt was no longer just a guardian of the sky. It was a hammer searching for things to break. The first real test came during the early months of 1944, when Allied intelligence reported that German supply lines were recovering faster than expected. Rail lines were repaired in days. Convoys moved under cover of night and fog. Artillery batteries repositioned constantly. The bombing raids were hitting cities and factories, but the arteries feeding the German army remained stubbornly alive. The solution arrived with the same deep roar that had once echoed across English airfields. Thunderbolts. They were sent low, very low, flying at treetop level, sometimes so close to the ground that branches snapped across the wings. The pilots were nervous at first. The P-47 was big, heavy, and not designed for delicate maneuvers in tight valleys or narrow rail corridors. But what happened next became legend. On a cold morning in February, a patrol of P-47s spotted a German freight train moving along a rail line south of Caen. It was a large freight train, loaded with ammunition, fuel, and vehicles covered with canvas tarps. The German engineer did not notice the jugs at first. The morning fog was still lifting, and no one expected American fighters this deep behind the lines. But the Thunderbolts saw the train, and without hesitation they climbed slightly, rolled into a shallow circle, and began their attack. The first jug dove straight down the rail line, guns blazing. 8 .50-caliber machine guns stitched the length of the cargo cars. Sparks, fire, and metal fragments exploded outward as rounds tore through crates and fuel drums. The second jug came in even lower, dropped tanks rattling, and released a pair of rockets that slammed into the locomotive. The engine erupted in a tower of flame. Steam bellowed from ruptured pipes. Cars twisted off the tracks. Soldiers inside the train leapt from doors and windows, scattering across the fields. But the jugs did not stop. They did not climb away. They circled and came back, diving again and again, each pass cutting deeper into the tangled wreckage. When they finally left, the sky behind them glowed orange, and the rail line was nothing but a smoking skeleton. Word of the attack spread across German units like wildfire. The Americans have new tactics. The big fighters are hitting ground targets. They do not fear our guns. For the first time, German ground forces began to dread the sound of the R-2800 engine. It had once been a distant thunder far above their heads. Now it was a scream that fell on them from out of nowhere. Thunderbolts attacked convoys along narrow forest roads, shattering half-tracks and Panzer IV tanks with bombs and rockets. They struck fuel depots and rail hubs, reducing them to smoking ruins. They pounded artillery positions with brutal dives that gave German gunners only seconds to react. And everywhere they went, the same pattern repeated. A roar in the distance, a speck in the sky, then thunder. One German infantry officer near the Ardennes front wrote in his diary, "First you hear them, then you look up, and then you pray they are not coming for you, because you cannot hide from the jug." Soon after, P-47 squadrons began operating in pairs and fours, striking targets of opportunity with terrifying precision. Their engines soaked up punishment. Their armor shrugged off small arms fire. Even light flak struggled to bring them down, and if a jug was hit, it usually kept flying anyway. Pilots returned to base with whole sections of their aircraft riddled with holes, paint scorched off the wings, and engine cowlings dented by exploding shells. Mechanics stared at the damage in disbelief. "How did you get this thing home?" The pilot would shrug. "Because it is a jug." During the Normandy invasion, the P-47 proved itself beyond all doubt. Thunderbolts flew hundreds of sorties per day, blasting German positions, ripping apart armored columns trying to reach the beaches, and tearing through rail lines feeding German defenses. Infantrymen on the ground cheered when they saw the broad wings approaching. The Germans learned to fear the sight. One Wehrmacht soldier wrote after surviving a jug attack, "It is not a fighter. It is a machine sent to destroy everything you can see." Another said, "When the jug dives, you can feel the earth tremble." P-47s dropped bombs with devastating force. They fired rockets that turned tanks into blackened shells. They strafed trucks until nothing moved. They strafed trenches until every soldier inside pressed himself into the dirt, praying the next burst would pass overhead. By the summer of 1944, the jug was no longer the flying milk jug. It was the Thunderbolt. And to the Germans, it was not simply thunder in the distance. It was thunder falling from the sky again and again, until every road, every bridge, every train, and every armored column became a target waiting for the scream of a P-47 diving. The sky was turning into fire. By the final year of the war, the P-47 Thunderbolt had achieved something no one had predicted when it first arrived in Europe. It had begun its life as a joke, a flying milk jug, a machine too large and too slow for the deadly dance of air combat. But by 1944 and into early 1945, the laughter had stopped. And in its place rose a different sound entirely: fear. Fear in the voices of German pilots who looked over their shoulders and saw the wide wings of a jug closing in. Fear in the hearts of German tank crews who heard the roar of a thunderbolt diving toward them. Fear among railway engineers who began to abandon trains the moment they spotted a silver shape in the distance. Fear among infantry columns who learned that the safest place was nowhere at all. The jug had become something more than an aircraft. It had become a symbol of American air power, a thunderclap, a force that rolled across Europe one dive at a time. And the Germans knew it. In late 1944, as the Allied armies pushed through France and Belgium, the P-47 was everywhere. It flew at dawn, striking supply lines while mist still clung to the ground. It flew at midday, blasting tanks that tried to regroup after the collapse of German armored units. It flew at dusk, hunting retreating columns, lighting up the roads with fire. It even flew at night, using moonlight to find the glint of metal on rail tracks. Wherever the German army moved, the jug found them. One of the most defining moments of the Thunderbolt legend came during the Battle of the Bulge. As German armor surged through the Ardennes, hoping to split the Allied lines, the weather protected them. Snowstorms rolled in, clouds smothered the sky. For days, American aircraft could not take off. German tanks and infantry pushed deeper, pressing the Allies back. But then the weather cleared, and the jug returned. The sound of R-2800 engines echoed across the freezing forests like the arrival of salvation. American infantry cheered. German commanders cursed. The skies turned from white to silver as hundreds of Thunderbolts and Mustangs roared overhead. The P-47 did not hesitate. It dove on German tank columns, smashing Panthers and Mark IVs with bombs and rockets. It strafed infantry in the open snow. It blasted fuel trucks that exploded into towering pillars of black smoke. The German advance, which had seemed unstoppable only days before, now slowed under a rain of fire. A German tank commander later admitted, "The Thunderbolt ended our hope. It owned the sky. It killed everything that moved." The legend grew with every engagement. In early 1945, as the Allies crossed into Germany itself, the jug became even more aggressive. Pilots no longer waited for perfect targets, they hunted for them. Rail lines, bridges, warehouses, convoys, armored battalions, artillery batteries. If it supported the German war machine, it was marked for destruction. And the jug delivered that destruction with ruthless efficiency. Thunderbolts attacked columns on narrow forest roads, firing rockets that turned tanks into burning husks. They strafed infantry in the open snow. They blasted fuel trucks that exploded into towering pillars of black smoke. The German advance, which had seemed unstoppable only days before, now slowed under a rain of fire. A German tank commander later admitted, "If the jug comes, get on the ground. Do not move. Do not look up. Do not try to run." Running was death. One day in March 1945, a German convoy near the town of Remagen attempted a desperate retreat across a narrow road. As they moved between the trees, the drivers heard it. A distant rumble, a steady growl, a vibration that rolled through the forest like a warning. The jugs arrived seconds later. They came in low, skimming the treetops, sunlight flashing off their wings. The first pass crippled the lead vehicles. The second pass set the fuel trucks ablaze. The third scattered the infantry into the ditches. Survivors later described it simply: the sky turned to fire. But it was not only the Germans who felt the weight of the jug. Allied soldiers, marching through mud and snow, lifted their heads in awe every time a formation of Thunderbolts passed overhead. They knew what the jug meant. It meant protection. It meant support. It meant that no matter how rough the terrain or how desperate the battle, the sky belonged to them. A young sergeant in the 2nd Armored Division wrote home, "When the jugs fly with us, we do not fear anything on the ground." By April 1945, the Luftwaffe was finished. Its last fighters scrambled in ones and twos, barely able to take off, let alone climb or maneuver. When one of these final German aircraft rose into the air, it often found a P-47 waiting for it. The Thunderbolt did not hesitate. It engaged with the same ferocity it had shown since the first day of combat. One of the final recorded encounters came when a lone FW-190 attempted to intercept a small American bomber group. Before it reached firing range, 2 jugs appeared from above and dropped onto its tail. The German pilot tried to dive. It was hopeless. The Thunderbolts caught him, firing in short bursts until the 190 burst into flames and crashed into a field below. It was symbolic, a final act in the long struggle that had begun with mocking laughter and ended with smoke drifting across German horizons. When the war finally ended in May 1945, pilots gathered around their Thunderbolts on quiet, silent airfields across Europe. The engines were cold, the guns were empty, the missions were over, but the legend of the jug was just beginning. It had started as a joke. It ended as one of the most feared weapons of the entire war. A machine that carried 850 caliber guns like fists of iron. A machine that dove at 800 kilometers per hour. A machine that could not be broken, would not be shaken, and refused to die. To the Germans, it was thunder. To the Americans, it was victory. And to history, it would always be the Thunderbolt.